November 8th, 1962, 3:42 a.m. The fire started in the kitchen of a third-floor walk-up on 131st Street. By the time the fire department arrived, the apartment was gone. Everything Mrs. Eleanor Washington had accumulated in 70 years of life — photographs, furniture, clothes, the quilt her mother had made in 1891 — reduced to ash. Eleanor stood on the street in her nightgown and a borrowed coat, watching smoke pour from the window of the home she'd lived in for 43 years. A crowd had gathered, neighbors, people from other buildings, a few police officers taking statements. Nobody asked the question that mattered. Nobody, except Bumpy Johnson, who arrived 20 minutes after the fire trucks, stood at the edge of the crowd and immediately understood what everyone else had missed. This wasn't an accident. Eleanor Washington wasn't important. Not in the way Harlem measured importance in 1962. She didn't run numbers, didn't own property, didn't have connections to politicians or mobsters or anyone who could make things happen. She was a retired seamstress who'd spent 50 years mending clothes for people who couldn't afford new ones. She lived alone. She went to church on Sundays. She kept to herself. The kind of person the city notices when they die, but not when they're suffering. Which is why, when her apartment burned down at 3:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning, the official response was perfunctory. Fire report filed, insurance claim denied because the building was old and the policy had lapsed. Red Cross provided temporary shelter for 3 days. After that, Eleanor Washington was on her own. The landlord, a man named Vincent Caruso who owned 6 buildings in Harlem and lived in Westchester, made it clear he wouldn't be rebuilding the apartment. Too expensive, too much trouble. He'd take the insurance money from the building claim and leave the unit vacant. When Eleanor asked where she was supposed to live, Caruso told her that wasn't his problem. The police listed the fire as accidental, faulty wiring, old building. These things happen. Nobody investigated further. Nobody cared. Except one person. November 10th, 1962. 2 p.m. Bumpy Johnson walked into the Union Baptist Church on 137th Street, where Eleanor Washington had been staying in a back room the pastor had offered temporarily. Eleanor was sitting at a small table, sorting through the few items neighbors had donated: a dress, some shoes, a Bible someone had left on her doorstep. When Bumpy entered, Eleanor looked up. She knew who he was. Everyone in Harlem knew who Bumpy Johnson was. "Mrs. Washington?" Bumpy said quietly, removing his hat. "Mr. Johnson." Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly as she folded the donated dress. "I heard about your home. I wanted to see if you needed anything." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something Bumpy hadn't expected. "I don't take charity, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate the offer, but I've managed on my own for 70 years. I'll manage now." Bumpy nodded slowly. "I respect that, but I'm not here to offer charity. I'm here to ask you a question." "What question?" "The fire. Was it an accident?" Eleanor's hands stopped moving. She looked down at the dress in her lap. "The police said it was faulty wiring." "I'm not asking what the police said. I'm asking what you know." Eleanor was quiet for 30 seconds. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "3 men came to my door 2 weeks ago. They said Mr. Caruso wanted me out of the building, said he was planning to renovate, raise the rents, bring in different tenants. They offered me $500 to leave quietly. Did you take it?" "No. I told them I had a lease, told them I'd lived there for 43 years and I wasn't leaving." "What did they say?" "They said I'd regret it."
Bumpy's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. "Can you describe them?" Eleanor described 3 men, young, white, Brooklyn accents. One had a scar over his left eye. Another wore a gold chain. The third did most of the talking, called himself Tony. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, he asked one more question. "Did you tell the police this?" "I tried. They said without proof there was nothing they could do. Said it could have been anyone. Could have been an accident like they ruled." Bumpy stood up slowly. "Mrs. Washington, I want you to stay here at the church as long as Pastor Williams will have you. Don't worry about finding a new place yet. Give me a few days." "Mr. Johnson, I told you I don't take—" "You're not taking anything," Bumpy interrupted gently. "You're just letting me handle something that needs handling." He put his hat back on. "Those 3 men who came to your door, they made a mistake. Not just burning your home, but thinking nobody would care enough to do anything about it." Eleanor looked at him with an expression Bumpy had seen many times before. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to remind people that in Harlem, we protect our own, even when the city won't." November 10th, 1962, 4:30 p.m. Bumpy's first call was to Julius Gordon. "I need you to find 3 men, Brooklyn crew, working for Vincent Caruso, the landlord. One's got a scar over his left eye, another wears a gold chain, the third does most of the talking, calls himself Tony." What did they do? Burned out a 70-year-old woman because she wouldn't leave her apartment. Julius was quiet for a moment. "Nobody cares about that kind of thing, Bumpy. It's not—"
"I care," Bumpy interrupted, "which means you care. Find them. I want names, addresses, where they drink, where they work, who protects them. I want everything by tomorrow morning." "And then what?" "And then I'm going to show them what happens when you target people who can't fight back." November 11th, 1962, 9 a.m. Julius delivered the information. The 3 men were low-level enforcers working for Vincent Caruso. Tony DeMarco, the talker. Sal Rossi, the one with the scar. Johnny Vento, the gold chain. They operated out of a social club in Brooklyn, did collections and evictions for Caruso and a few other landlords. Small time, mean but not smart. They'd been bragging about the fire, laughing about how the old lady had cried when they showed up, how easy it was to torch the place once she was asleep. Bumpy read the report without expression. Then he made 3 phone calls. The first was to Vincent Caruso. "Vincent, this is Bumpy Johnson." "Bumpy," Caruso's voice was cautious, "what can I do for you?" "You can explain why 3 men working for you burned down an old woman's apartment on 131st Street. Silence. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Tony DeMarco, Sal Rossi, Johnny Vento, they work for you. They burned Eleanor Washington's home because she wouldn't take your buyout offer." "Bumpy, I'm not calling to argue, Vincent. I'm calling to tell you what's going to happen. You're going to rebuild Mrs. Washington's apartment. Same building, same floor, everything exactly as it was. You're going to cover all her expenses while it's being rebuilt, and you're going to do it within 30 days. That's going to cost. I don't care what it costs. You're going to do it. And if I refuse, then every tenant in every building you own in Harlem is going to stop paying rent. Every violation in your buildings is going to get reported to the city. Every inspector who's ever overlooked a problem is going to suddenly start caring about code compliance. And your 3 guys who burned that apartment, they're going to have problems you can't fix. You can't. I can, and I will. You've got 24 hours to commit to rebuilding that apartment. After that, I stop asking nicely." Bumpy hung up. The second call was to a city councilman named Robert Wade, who owed Bumpy for helping get him elected in 1960. "Robert, I need building inspectors sent to every property Vincent Caruso owns in Harlem.
I need them to find every violation, every safety issue, every code problem. And I need it done this week. Bumpy, I can't just... You can, and you will. Because if you don't, the next election is going to be very difficult for you. Wade sighed. I'll make some calls. The third call was the shortest and the most important.
Bumpy dialed a number that connected to a social club in Brooklyn, where Tony DeMarco, Sal Rossi, and Johnny Vento spent their evenings. Tell Tony DeMarco that Bumpy Johnson wants to meet him tonight, midnight, the warehouse on Kent Avenue. Come alone. November 11th, 1962, 11:45 p.m. Tony DeMarco showed up 15 minutes early with Sal and Johnny. Not alone, but Bumpy had expected that. The warehouse was empty, except for Bumpy standing in the center under a single light and Julius Gordon near the door. Tony walked forward, trying to project confidence he probably didn't feel. "You wanted to talk?" Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the three men, memorizing their faces. Finally, he spoke. 2 weeks ago, you went to an apartment on 131st Street. You threatened a 70-year-old woman named Eleanor Washington. When she didn't leave, you came back and burned her home down while she was sleeping. "I don't know what you're talking about," said Tony. "Yes, you do, and I'm not here to argue about it. I'm here to explain what's going to happen next." Sal's hand moved toward his jacket. Julius took 2 steps forward, and Sal's hand stopped moving. "You have 2 choices. First choice, you leave New York tonight, all 3 of you. You don't come back. You don't work for Caruso anymore. You don't do collections. You don't do evictions. You find a different line of work in a different city." "And if we don't?" Tony asked. "Second choice, you stay in New York, and I make sure that every person you've ever terrorized, every tenant you've ever threatened, every family you've ever harmed, they all find out where you live, where you drink, where you sleep, and I stop protecting them from them." "You can't." "I already did. There's a reporter from the Amsterdam News who's very interested in writing a story about 3 men who burned down a 70-year-old woman's home. He's got your names, he's got your addresses, he's got photographs. The only thing stopping that story from running is my phone call." Bumpy pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to Tony. "That's a list of every tenant you've ever evicted, every family you've ever threatened, every person Vincent Caruso sent you to intimidate. 43 names. They all live in Harlem. They all know each other. And tomorrow morning, they're all going to know who burned Eleanor Washington's home." Tony looked at the list, and for the first time, his confidence cracked. "Unless you're gone," Bumpy finished. "You've got until sunrise. After that, this becomes a community problem. And community problems in Harlem, they don't get solved with police reports." November 12th, 1962, 6 a.m. Tony DeMarco, Sal Rossi, and Johnny Vento left Brooklyn before dawn. Nobody saw them leave. Nobody knew where they went. Vincent Caruso called Bumpy at 9 a.m. to confirm he'd rebuild Eleanor Washington's apartment. By noon, building inspectors had found 67 code violations across Caruso's Harlem properties. By 5 p.m., Caruso had hired contractors to start repairs on Eleanor's building. Within 48 hours of Bumpy's conversation with Eleanor Washington, 3 men who'd terrorized tenants for years had vanished from New York, and a 70-year-old woman's home was being rebuilt. Nobody knew exactly what Bumpy had done. Nobody knew where Tony, Sal, and Johnny had gone. All they knew was that someone had cared enough to do something, and in Harlem, that was enough. December 20th, 1962. Eleanor Washington moved back into her apartment on 131st Street. New floors, new walls, new kitchen, everything rebuilt exactly as it had been, but better.
Bumpy didn't attend the small gathering the neighbors held to welcome her home. He sent Julius with an envelope containing $2,000 to help her replace what she'd lost. Julius opened the envelope, counted the money, and told Julius to tell Mr. Johnson she didn't take charity. Julius smiled. He said you'd say that. He said to tell you it's not charity. It's rent you overpaid for 43 years living in a building that wasn't properly maintained. This is your refund. Eleanor looked at the money for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her purse. Tell Mr. Johnson thank you, and tell him I'll pray for him. He'd appreciate that, ma'am. The story of what happened to Tony DeMarco, Sal Rossi, and Johnny Vento became one of those Harlem legends that people told but couldn't quite verify. Some said they'd left the country. Others said they'd joined the military under assumed names. A few claimed they were working construction in Alaska under new identities. Nobody knew for sure. What everyone did know was that after November 11, 1962, not a single tenant in Caruso's buildings was threatened or evicted. Caruso became the most careful landlord in Harlem, maintaining his properties meticulously, never raising rents unfairly, treating his tenants with respect. Because he understood what Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated, there's a difference between power that protects and power that preys. And in Harlem, the only power that lasted was the kind that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Eleanor Washington lived in that rebuilt apartment for another 11 years. She died in 1973, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the few possessions she'd managed to replace and the many friends who'd helped her rebuild. At her funeral, Bumpy Johnson sat in the back row, quiet and unremarked, just another mourner paying respects. When the service ended, someone asked him why he'd come. Because she mattered, Bumpy said simply. But she wasn't just anything, Bumpy interrupted. She was part of this community, and when someone tries to hurt this community, especially someone who can't fight back, that becomes everyone's problem. Is that why you made those 3 men disappear? Bumpy smiled slightly. I didn't make anyone disappear. I just gave them a choice. Stay and face the consequences of their actions, or leave and start over somewhere else. What if they'd stayed? Then 43 families would have made sure they regretted it. I didn't need to do anything except make sure people knew who to hold accountable. He stood up to leave. Real power isn't about how much force you can use. It's about whether you choose to protect the strong or the weak. Anyone can protect the strong, but protecting the weak, that requires something most people don't have. What's that? The belief that everyone matters, not just the people who can pay you back. Years later, when people asked about Bumpy Johnson's legacy, they often focused on the wrong things: the numbers racket, the conflicts with the mob, the years in prison. But the people who actually lived in Harlem during Bumpy's time, they remembered different stories. They remembered the time 3 men burned down an old woman's home, and Bumpy made those men vanish in 48 hours. They remembered that when the city didn't care, when the police didn't investigate, when the landlord refused to help, Bumpy Johnson cared enough to act. Not with violence, not with grand gestures, with pressure, leverage, and the understanding that a community's strength is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. Eleanor Washington was just one old woman, but to Bumpy Johnson, she was Harlem. And nobody burned Harlem without answering for it. That's not revenge, that's protection. And protection, when delivered with precision and purpose, is the only power worth having.